המושב הראשון אין כמו בבית ספר על תהליכי למידה של מורים תוך כדי תפקיד. המושב ייפתח בהרצאה של האורחת המכובדת שלנו אילנה הורן, ולאחר מכן אנחנו ניתן לכם 3 דקות לשלוח שאלות באמצעות תהליך מקוון שאני אסביר בהמשך, ויהיו 4 מגיבים, ולאחר המגיבים אנחנו מקווים גם לשוחח עם הקהל על השאלות וההערות שאתם תשלחו. אני אסביר יותר על זה בהמשך. ואני מאוד מתכבד להזמין את פרופסור אילנה הורן מאוניברסיטת ונדרבליט. כששאלנו את עצמנו מי הכי היינו רוצים לשמוע על הנושא הזה, אז לא הייתה לנו שום ספק שזאת אילנה, שאני חושב שהיא המומחית המובילה בעולם היום בתחום הזה של למידה של מורים תוך כדי עבודה במקום העבודה. תודה רבה אילנה.
It's an honor to be here today to share some of my thinking about this issue of teachers' workplace learning. I've been studying this topic for almost 20 years, more than 20 years now, which I guess makes me old. And the reason why I study this topic is because I was a teacher. I started as a teacher, and we have a lot of ideas in circulation in education, a lot of ideas about what good instruction looks like, and yet, even though this has been going on for a very long time now, it's very difficult. There's this constant problem of bringing good ideas about education into classrooms. And when I started as a graduate student, as a young researcher, a lot of that research was about activities and professional development and how do we describe these practices better. But from my own experience as a teacher, I saw that schools are very, very complex places. And students and communities are very complex places. So in my view, the way that professional development was being studied, which was sort of a process product kind of model of here's the professional development as an input, are we getting the output we desire? I felt like it missed a whole middle part, which is why I have been studying teachers' workplace learning as a way of thinking about professional development. So to give you an overview of this talk, these first couple of parts will be rather brief. I'm going to tell you a little more about what I study and how I study it. But really, with an eye on this question, which I know is a big question for the ministry and for the initiatives that you have going on in the country right now, which is this challenge of systemic instructional improvement. So from my little tiny vantage point of looking at teachers' workplace, I'm trying to think up to the level of systems and what the implications are for the looking at people in their workplace for these questions and initiatives at the systemic level. And I'll talk in a little more detail about what I've been finding in my research that can speak to this question of systemic improvement. And I'm going to provide an example from a current research project about some ideas of some of my current thinking. So this is work in progress, but when I have an opportunity to speak like this and kind of think together with a group of people, as I understood this conference to be organized to support, I like to tell you what I'm working on because it'll help me think better with the things I'm thinking about now. And of course, I'll offer some of the remaining puzzles. Obviously, there's many, but the ones that I feel are raised by my talk. Okay, so briefly, what do I study? So like I said, I study teachers learning, primarily math teachers learning. I was a math teacher. My background is as a mathematics teacher. And in the US, mathematics is a really critical domain in the sense that we have a lot of issues with underperformance. We have a lot of issues with teacher staffing. So mathematics education has been a focus for us in the US. And like I said in my introductory comments, oftentimes when we think about wanting to improve a discipline in the schools, we think about mechanisms of professional development. But one of the critiques that's been there since before I even entered this field is that our descriptions of professional development often remain at the level of activity, and there hasn't been as much inquiry into the processes of teacher learning. So if we center teacher learning, instead of saying, does it work to have workshops or does it work to have professional learning communities, as if the activity itself was the question, I'm trying to press on understanding better what it means for teachers to learn and to center that as the phenomenon of interest, rather than is it this activity or that activity. It's the question of how do teachers learn. So the way I study this has been to take an anthropological perspective. I started out by finding places where there were strong teacher communities, a lot of teacher collaboration. And the reason for that was that there's a lot of sociological research that shows that when we find schools or classes, particularly schools though, where students are performing above what would be expected based on demographic variables, there's always a strong teacher community there. So there's been a longstanding conjecture in the sociology of education that teacher community supports instructional improvement. So that there must be some kind of learning happening when teachers collaborate in particular ways. Because we know not all teacher collaboration leads to these kinds of results, but that pretty consistently when we find these results, we find them in places where there's strong teacher collaboration. So I went in my dissertation research to observe in places where there were strong teacher communities. And I used teachers' talk as my primary data. Now, those of you who are familiar with cognitive science might be familiar with this idea of a talk aloud protocol, where you have people talk through as they're solving a problem and analyze it as a way of understanding how they're making sense of the problem. I treated these teacher collaborative conversations as found talk aloud protocols. So I didn't ask the teachers, I didn't prompt them, tell me how are you thinking about your teaching. But I recorded, I videotaped, I took field notes of their conversations and used that as data to think about how they were thinking about the problems of practice that were arising. And I've been using this method for quite some time now in a lot of different contexts. And what it allows me to see is how teachers are thinking about the problems of practice that come up as they teach. And particularly with a particular interest in trying to adopt innovative instructional practices. So when I listen to teachers talking, I can hear a bunch of things. I can hear how they're defining the problems. So are they saying, the problem is that I've got some fast kids in this class and I've got some slow kids in this class and I don't know how to fix that gap. That's one definition of a problem. I can hear how they address those problems. They could say, well, we clearly need to group the fast kids together and the slow kids together. Or they can say, we need to think about the social dynamics in the classroom and why are kids continuing to play the role of fast and slow. Are there problems we can assign that might challenge the fast kids to slow down and think more carefully about the mathematics? So those are examples of defining problems and thinking about how to address them that give me insight into how different groups of teachers might be thinking about their instruction. In addition to how they're thinking, I can see the resources that they're drawing on. What curricula do they have access to? How are they thinking about the role of policy in the choices that they make? And I also see the limitations they face. Our classes are too big. We can't really give that kind of individualized attention. That would be nice, but it's not possible. So I hear all of those discussions as they talk. All right, so that, like I said, is a pretty micro view of what's happening in instruction. So it seems maybe a little bit bold of me to say I've been spending 20 plus years eavesdropping on teachers, watching them eat lunch while they meet. That's usually what they're doing, or after school snacks. So I've been spending time really looking at this micro level. On what basis can I think about broader issues of instructional improvement? Well, I have been involved in some research projects where, while we've been looking at the bigger goals of a district-wide initiative, I've also been focusing on the teachers and trying to think about, oops, I didn't know that was on. I've been thinking about the relationships between these broad initiatives and these tiny conversations that teachers have. I feel like there's sort of this idealized narrative we have of how we wish instructional improvement happened. Somebody, whether it's a researcher or a teacher or somebody somewhere, has a good idea about something in education. So take a moment and think about something you would wish teachers did. What's your good idea that you wish teachers did? Hang on to that, because I'm hoping that you will keep that in mind as I sort of work through this narrative, so maybe you can think for yourself about how we wish this happened and how it really happens. So we kind of wish that somebody had a good idea, they shared their good idea, and everybody uses it. The end, right? But we know that that's not what really happens. So I'm going to talk about some of the things that I see happening when we try to share ideas. Okay, so what really happens? Somebody has a good idea, they share it, and some people adapt it, some people transform it, and some people reject it altogether. Right? Has everybody seen that with your good idea? Okay. Maybe not. Maybe somebody lives in the fairy tale world. So like I said, there's a lot of reasons for this. I'm going to share 4 of them. One is that distortions may come from how the idea is communicated. So there's something about the communication that is failing to convey the meaning of the practice. It could come from how the idea is understood. So maybe it's a really nice, clear description of whatever the practice is, but the listeners, the people making sense of it, have their own ideas that distort the meaning. Or maybe the issue is that the person who came up with the idea didn't account for some of the details of their context and how it differs from the context of the users, the teachers on the other end. And so there's details that are missing to make that work in the other contexts. The last way that these things can get distorted is that there may be contradictions with this good idea and some other commitments and practices that are already in existence in the schools or in the communities. Okay, so this is what I've seen over and over again. And here's what my research says about this problem. It's inevitable. The fairy tale doesn't exist. It doesn't even really make sense if we think about the details of teaching and learning, that somehow we're going to be able to convey this practice in a perfect way, and everyone's going to take it up without any kind of problems. In fact, not only is it inevitable, it's necessary, because schools are different, teachers are different, children are different, and the idea that we could take some kind of ideal type and have it make sense everywhere in any kind of detail is, like I said, a fairy tale. So here's the question, and this is where things get really tricky and, in my view, get very interesting. If adaptations are inevitable, if they're always going to happen and, in fact, they're necessary, how can we ensure that they are sensible? Can we ensure that they're sensible with the purpose of whatever instructional innovation you were thinking of when I started this set of examples? Because we know that sometimes adaptations can be too much. Oops, I forwarded too quickly. So an example that I've seen a lot in my work is formative assessment. So formative assessment is one of those kinds of practices that has a lot of research behind it. When we have good formative assessment, it helps improve student learning. It helps teachers adapt their practice in meaningful ways. There's a lot of evidence out there that using formative assessment is a good idea in education for improving student achievement. So what happens? Well, one thing I saw happen in one study I did was the teachers were taken to professional development. Formative assessment is a good idea. And they were given a way to implement it. Ask students if they understand as you're teaching. Ask them to give a thumbs up if they feel like they understand, a thumbs down if they don't understand, and a sideways if they're not sure. And you can do that as you're teaching, the professional development people said, so that you can check for student understanding. Okay, well, it got taken up in a lot of different ways. One teacher forgot about it, kind of mostly did the same thing that they had always done. Another asked the students to show their thumbs, but it didn't make any content, it didn't change the instruction, right? It's like, oh good, now I know half of you get it. Great, next thing. Another one tried it, found it didn't work, and left it alone, right? So there's a lot of details. It's not enough to say formative assessment is good, formative assessment is helpful, here's an example of how to use it. There's a lot of other details that teachers need to figure out in order to make that a meaningful practice in their classrooms. I think one of the biggest, if I could give you one thing to take away from my talk today, it would be this, and I'm sorry I didn't write it up on a slide. I thought of it last night after Renana had already downloaded my slides. But if I could give you one thing to take away, it would be that we leave the complex work of integration to teachers. We treat the idea of application and integration into practice as if it's trivial when it's actually the hardest part. And I think that's crazy. And that's it. Okay. So that sense-making that happens as teachers are trying to integrate new practices is really a question of teacher learning that we should take seriously. And a lot of times teachers themselves think that it's sufficient to go to a professional development workshop and learn something like this. I learned it, I know it now, right? So we need to also help teachers understand that this isn't enough. Who's with me? Okay. All right, forget it. I'm not going to use any of that information. Okay. So this is where looking at these conversations that teachers have is really illuminating to these problems, because these conversations really surface all the complicated issues of integration and application that teachers are taking on. And so when I'm looking at these conversations, I'm really focusing on teachers' sense-making. And I've developed a way of thinking about what are the opportunities to learn in these conversations? How can these conversations help teachers with this really complicated work of integration and application? And so I've started to really look at conversations for how these interactions provide teachers with conceptual resources to interpret teaching issues. So, okay, you've got this. You see you have a class where half the kids are like this and half the kids are like that, right? How are you going to make sense of that? What is your next move as a teacher? How are you going to take that up? Are you going to just keep teaching your lesson as it's written in your lesson plan? Are you going to stop? What tools do you have to take that feedback and make it meaningful in your instruction? Those kinds of things are the conceptual resources that might come out in teacher's conversation. And relatedly, it gives them a next step. It mobilizes them for future work. So it's not enough to say, yeah, sometimes that happens to me. Sometimes when half the thumbs are up and half the thumbs are down, I know that some of the kids are just not paying attention. No, I don't think so. I think that I've noticed that the thumbs down happen for the kids who really have, We have a lot of immigrant students in some of the schools I work in. They're not understanding the language. You need to help them understand the meaning of the words. So pair them with somebody who is a native speaker who might be able to help translate some of the ideas for them. So all of these things are both conceptual resources in terms of interpreting the nature of the problem and mobilization for future work. How am I going to act differently in the future based on my new interpretation and my new understanding of this practice, of what I see when I employ this practice? So here's an example of an opportunity to learn in a conversation I eavesdropped on. So these teachers were looking at results from a standardized test. And they noticed that a lot of their students missed a question on a geometry item that they were surprised that they missed. So they're looking at the item, and one of the teachers says, one of the things that threw them, they're used to seeing the dimensions on the sides of the figure. But they, the test writers, labeled it differently. And then another teacher says, dimensions is one of those words with multiple meanings. We need to go over that more. So this isn't a deep example. Sometimes it's hard to find things that are simple for a talk that can go quickly, but illustrate a point, but maybe not the deepest thing. So this is one of those. It's very concise, but the teachers looked at the data, they looked at the item, they saw that they were surprised at how many students missed an item. They interpreted what was going on. Aha, the way the diagram was labeled was confusing for the students. We need to make sure they really understand this confusing word of dimension, right? So, a little example. So what I've found is that in these kinds of conversations, epistemic stances matter. So if you think back to my list of 4 reasons why things get distorted, how the idea is communicated and how it is understood, epistemic stances, how we think about what knowledge is, what teaching is, what our discipline is, what learning is, how students learn, all of those things about how knowledge gets constructed through teaching and learning, those matter. And teachers have a lot of assumptions about those things. And it's one of the parts when I said we act as if we do certain kinds of professional development, we can look at the outcomes. This is where teachers' ideas and teachers' agency is really consequential. Do you think learning is being able to perform well on a test? Do you think learning is sense-making? Do you think teaching is helping you understand disciplinary practices? Or do you think teaching is learning what's in the textbook, right? Just to give a few examples of a range of epistemic stances that teachers might have that are consequential for how you take up a practice. The second thing is that accomplished teachers, and notice I didn't say experienced. Experienced and accomplished aren't the same thing. Accomplished teachers talk differently about their work than less accomplished teachers. So what do I mean by accomplished? Because obviously there's values in that. What I mean by accomplished are teachers who know how to be responsive to students' thinking in their instruction and know how to design classrooms in ways that are responsive to students' thinking and help them understand the discipline. And they talk differently about their work than less accomplished teachers. So here's an example of an epistemic stance. Again, this was from the same study where we were looking at teachers using standardized test data to make sense of their instruction. And this was an educator who said, before he had his teachers, he was a leader, and he was having the teachers look at the standardized test data. And he framed the activity by saying, the importance of this before we get started is to dig deep to make sure we're meeting kids' individual need. We're talking to them about their test scores, that we're having those conversations that motivate them. So within this quote, there are a lot of assumptions being made about knowledge, about teaching. In particular, this idea of making sure we're meeting kids' individual need. Not all teachers think that that's the goal, right? That's a particular stance on what it means to teach. We're talking to them about their test scores. So it's holding the test scores as valuable, and it's seeing the teachers, part of the teacher's role as mediating and communicating the meaning of the test scores with students. And that we're having those conversations that motivate them. So the idea that a conversation between a teacher and a child can be a motivating thing for students. There's a lot of details missing, but there are some basic assertions being made in this framing that reveal this educator's stances on knowledge. Okay, so what about this idea that accomplished teachers talk differently? Well, we did a study where we compared the talk of 3 groups of teachers at different levels of instructional accomplishment. And the most accomplished teachers we found spent more time talking about problems of practice. So I suggested earlier in this talk that one of the things I can hear when I listen to teachers talk is the problems that come up. So a lot of teachers, more typically, oh, I'm having trouble with, boy, I'm usually really good at coming up with these examples off my head. I'm having trouble because my class is being noisy. Oh, tada. So I'm having trouble because my class is being noisy. Most of the time, those kinds of problems that are introduced, a more experienced teacher will say, oh, you just need to, and give them a piece of advice, and then they move on. It's usually a very brief exchange. The more accomplished teachers spend a lot more time talking about each individual problems. What do you mean by noisy? Is it good noisy or bad noisy? What are you noticing, right? And they'll elicit more details to really be able to think about the particulars of the problem that the teacher is bringing to the group. The other thing was that there was a lot more of a dynamic interplay between broad ideas about teaching and the local particulars. So, yeah, my kids were really, really noisy today. Well, what were you teaching? We were doing that lesson on unit rate. Oh, goodness. Well, I know that our kids sometimes really panic as soon as you write a fraction on the board. So you need to think about ways of introducing some of the ideas before you write the fraction on the board. Have a conversation about ratio, but don't say the word fraction, right? So there's this sort of general thing of that our kids, well, there's this general thing about the kind of noisiness that the teacher encountered, the kind of fear reaction they saw in their classroom, but specified to a particular curriculum topic that the other more experienced teacher maybe has some insight into. The other thing, and also following on that example, is that the more accomplished teachers more frequently considered students' cognitive and affective experience. So there was a lot more perspective taking. There was a lot more of, like I said, our students sometimes feel fearful as soon as you write a fraction on the board. Talk about ratios first. All right, that took 3 clicks. I'm not sure why. In those conversations where they're spending more time on problems of practice while they're sort of linking these broad ideas to the specifics and particulars and taking students' perspectives, we're finding that those conversations are rich with learning opportunities. So this is a little bit of a paradox because this is the more accomplished teachers whose conversations are rich with learning opportunities. Does everybody see that that's a bit of a contradiction? Because we want the teachers who need the more learning opportunities to get the more learning opportunities. So in the paper we wrote about this, we called it a Matthew effect. It's a rich get richer situation, right? Which is something, a learning phenomenon we'll see, like good readers read better, right? And they can learn more from text, right? So it's one of those kinds of learning situations where accomplished teachers can learn more from talking to colleagues than less accomplished teachers. So I think it's a kind of a cautionary tale for people who are using professional learning communities as an intervention for supporting professional development. So this table, don't worry about the tiny, tiny print, was from a study that we did where we when we were working with those districts who were working to improve math instruction, and we recorded 110 meetings from teachers, and we coded them. We went, first of all, we only selected groups of teachers that we asked the district leaders, we said, where are the good collaborations happening? So we looked in the good collaborations, and we recorded the meetings, and we coded them based on the depth of learning opportunities that were there. And so these are the 6 categories that we use to code the meetings. And those bottom 2 are the ones where we saw a lot of learning opportunities, where the conversation was more dialogical between the teachers, and they were doing more of this elaboration of concepts. And what we found is that in those meetings, only about 1/3 of them from these purposely selected teacher groups that were good collaboration, only about 1/3 of them sort of had this richer kind of high-depth conversation going on. So one of the things we take away from that is that it's pretty rare to have a group of teachers come together and talk in this sort of high-depth way about instructional practice. So conversations rich with learning opportunities are rare. So what does this have to do with that earlier story where I was interrupting the fairy tale about implementing good instructional ideas? Well, if it's inevitable that when a good idea gets shared, it needs to be adapted and interpreted, these kinds of conversations among teachers can be a place where they do adapt in sensible ways, and they can kind of make sense of the practice together so that it can be taken up in ways that are meaningful, that it doesn't approach what my colleague Anne Brown called lethal mutations of the practice, right? So the question then is, if these kinds of collaborative conversations or conversations with teachers are kind of the best shot we have of supporting sensible adaptations of practice, but they're still pretty rare when you just go and look in the wild and see, are they happening? Is it possible for us to design conversations that can get teachers to go in sort of that deeper conceptual territory? So now I'm going to take a sip of water, because this is the part where I'm going into the less well-known territory. Thank you. That was my water drinking music. Okay, so where are we in our story? So does everybody understand the thread here? The adaptations are inevitable, right? Adaptations are inevitable. So we want to make sure they're sensible. So we want to give teachers resources in their schools or communities to make those adaptations. Now, I don't know what that one is. More water? Okay, I'm very well hydrated now. Okay, so adaptation is inevitable. We want them to be sensible. Conversations among colleagues are a good way to make that happen, but they're rare. Can we make them happen? That's what I'm trying to figure out. So this is my team. This is my project. It's called Project Sigma. It's sponsored by the National Science Foundation. I have to say that because they give me money. You might recognize Nadav, who's here today. Yay. And we are working to try to see if we can foster learning conversations with teachers. And we're working with a professional development organization called Math for America Los Angeles. And we're working with experienced math teachers. They've all have 5 or more years of experience. Many of them have over 20 years of experience. and they're all very invested in their own professional learning around instructional innovations in mathematics education. If I had to sort of give an overarching idea of what the good idea is that they're all working on, it's on supporting students' mathematical sense making, right? Helping students actually make sense of disciplinary ideas. So we've developed this process to try to end up with these rich learning conversations. So we have what we call the video formative feedback process. And the first thing we do is we ask a focal teacher, what are your questions about your teaching? What are you trying to get better at? And I want to say that this question, when we say, what are you trying to get better at? Most of our teachers have an answer, but we usually have to push them to be a little more specific. The second thing we say to them is, what should we look for in your classroom to see if you're doing what you want to be doing? That's another place where we find that they're kind of stuck. They have these big ideas of what they're trying to get better at, but they haven't really thought necessarily about what that would mean in their classroom. So we push them to do that, and they will share a sketch of their lesson, and they'll coordinate their observation with our team. The second thing we do is during the lesson, we have the teachers select 4 focal student groups for observation, and we come into the classroom with 2 video cameras. It's a little crazy. It looks something like this. So we have a teacher on the right over there who's wearing a GoPro video camera that helps us capture his point of view as he's walking around the classroom. And then in the back of the classroom, this is an iPad that has a robot tripod on it that follows the teacher around as he moves through the classroom. So we have sort of a whole class view and a sort of point of view camera. And the iPad camera is the one that has 4 microphones that we can put on students' desks. There's a lot of murmuring, and I'm not sure what it is. Do we need another bell to let you talk? Okay. Then within 24 to 48 hours, we review the videos with the teacher's questions in mind. We then meet with the focal teacher and his or her colleagues to discuss the video. And that looks something like this. And we record those conversations because this is research. And what we're finding, we've done this 25 times now with 6 different teams. And we found that every single one of these conversations has gone to that higher depth dialogical place of helping teachers really consider the reasons for their practices and the nature of their adaptations. The problems that teachers bring up kind of fall into a few categories. One is sort of the perennial problems of teaching. So sometimes they'll say things like, what is reasonable for students to understand by the end of this lesson? That's a question that is an eternal question of teaching, right? There could be questions that are related to these visions of ambitious instruction, the particular innovation that they're working for. So what does it mean to foster rich classroom discourse? That's a question we hear a lot. There could be some content-specific issues that come up. So how do I address students' misconceptions? So what do these rich conversations look like in the context of these video formative feedback conversations? Well, I'm going to quickly, because I'm running out of time, run through an example from one of the teams. So there's 2 teachers, Lizette, who's in her 7th year of teaching, and Julie, who's in her 5th year, and we recorded Julie's class. One of my doctoral students, who's now a professor, Brett Garner, was the facilitator. And the teacher's goal was working on teaching for understanding in a high school statistics class. So the topic of the lesson was looking at biased survey questions. And Julie was wondering what the students were talking about as they worked. How much are they understanding this idea of biased survey questions? So within the video of the class lesson, the video clip that we viewed together showed the students brainstorming this idea of situational bias in survey questions. And the students seemed to understand it. They're saying to each other, it's like saying, oh, what's your least favorite quality of your girlfriend when you're asking someone who's by themselves when they're alone, versus saying, what's your least favorite quality about your girlfriend when the girlfriend is standing right there? Okay, that works. And as the teachers are listening to the students debate, they realize that the students' conversation keeps steering towards yes or no questions. They're discounting categorical answers like what's the least favorite quality of the girlfriend, or numerical questions. So Brett, who's facilitating, is trying to uncover the conceptual issue that's going on in the students' dialogue. Yeah, so this group ends up deciding that this has to be a yes or no question. I think because all of your examples are yes or no, even though I can't remember what sparked that debate. So they start talking about other kinds of situational bias. Like, for example, a numerical one would be asking people about their weight, right? So if you ask people about their weight, they're probably going to have some situational bias to underplay that. So Julie starts to connect this issue of the student's misconception to curricular design. She says, yeah, because all my examples were yes, no. So that's probably why they didn't think outside the box in that way. Interesting. That'd be something to bring up, because we get into those differences later in the year. Don't worry about the math there. That's a big distinction that we make, but we haven't yet. I would maybe hold it as an example next year. Then they can think of it the same way. And then Julie starts to realize, wait a minute, this is where we're talking about situational bias. This isn't just in this unit that this becomes an issue. Long term, not understanding, thinking that all survey questions have to be yes, no, that kind of messes up a lot of my teaching. That's a big issue in stats. That's a big issue in stats, is that issue between those two, quantitative, categorical. Kids really have issues determining the difference and knowing where to proceed. It just seems so simple, but it takes a lot of time to get ingrained in them. Sometimes a lot of them don't even get it until the very end. So in the end, she starts to realize the way that her curriculum design cued the students towards a misconception. And she started to think about how that played out over the course of the year. So this kind of digging into the details of students' thinking helped her illuminate some of the ways in which her teaching was pushing, it was sort of a situational bias. It was biasing students towards understanding the nature of survey questions in ways that weren't productive to their learning. So what we found was that these VFFs provided conceptual material and epistemic resources to support rich conversations about instruction that highlight some of the challenges around implementing instructional innovations. Okay, back to the 10,000-foot view of what policymakers should do with this, because there's a lot of puzzles that remain. I gave an example from a very well-resourced particular project where we were able to cultivate these kinds of rich learning conversations, but that's hard to do at scale. So how do we provide practicing teachers with the resources and incentives to investigate their own practice in these ways? How do we provide them with the epistemic and social resources? Because one of the key aspects that we're finding in these conversations is the facilitators identifying key moments in instruction, helping press the teachers towards making connections between these details about what the students are saying and doing and thinking and the broader teaching issues in play. And I think that this is a really big question. Do we have a sufficiently shared vision of teaching, learning, and students to work toward as a society? I mean, one of the big issues in the US, we are coming out of decades now of accountability-based reform where test scores are kind of the key indicator of whether or not learning has happened. And we know that tests have a lot of shortcomings, especially when they're evaluating students with learning differences, when they're evaluating students whose first language isn't English, in our case. And so they're not a perfect instrument, and yet they are becoming sort of the only thing that matters in a lot of schools. And so is good teaching just getting good test results, or is good teaching about building citizens? Is it more of a democratic idea of teaching? And I think that wrestling with these questions is really critical, because what makes sense to advise a teacher to do really depends on what you think the goal of teaching and learning is. Okay, I went really fast at the end, and I think I'm a little bit ahead of time. But thank you very much, and I welcome the conversation that's coming.